in the heart of Rome, where the air was thick with ambition and the streets echoed with the clash of power. A woman emerged whose name would become synonymous with political intrigue, rebellion, and the unyielding desire to shape the destiny of an empire. Fulvia, born into the chaotic yet vibrant world of late Republican Rome, stood as a testament to the indomitable will of a woman determined to command her fate in a society that largely relegated her to the shadows of history. The late Republic was a time of immense instability, where political power shifted as frequently as the tides of the Tiber. The assassinations, betrayals, and shifting alliances that would define the fall of Rome's republic were already set in motion by the time Fulvia first stepped onto the stage of history. With every battle fought and every political maneuver made, the future of the Roman world seemed to hinge on the actions of a few powerful men, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian among them. Yet it was a woman, often overlooked and underestimated, who would shape the course of history in ways that would echo through the centuries. Fulvia's life, however, was no simple tale of a noblewoman's role behind the scenes. Hers was a journey that began with personal tragedy, unfolded through strategic marriages, and culminated in a fierce political battle that would make her a central figure in the struggle for control of Rome. Her story is not merely the tale of a wife, a mother, or a widow, though she was all of those things. It is the story of a woman who wielded the power of her intellect, her connections, and her resilience to carve a path through the treacherous landscape of Roman politics. This is not just the story of a woman in history. This is the story of a woman who made history, who rose from the shadows of Roman society to stand at the forefront of an empire in the making. In her quest for power, love, and legacy, Fulvia's life intertwined with the greatest names of the era. And yet, her tale is often relegated to mere footnotes in the histories written by men. The story of Fulvia begins in the very streets that would later bear witness to her boldest acts of defiance. But it is a story that is only just starting, one that will delve into the heart of ambition, the depths of love and betrayal, and the fierce battle for control of a dying republic. Welcome to the world of Fulvia, a woman who refused to be forgotten. The cold marble floors of the Fulvia family villa in Rome were always cool underfoot, a reminder of the ancient power that resided within these walls. Fulvia had grown up in these halls, where the voices of senators, generals, and politicians murmured endlessly, discussing alliances and rivalries, war and peace. Her father, Marcus Fulvius, a member of the esteemed Fulvia family, had taught her from an early age that power was something one seized, not inherited. The city outside, with its towering temples and grand forums, pulsed with ambition and the dangerous promises of greatness. Fulvia was no stranger to such promises. She had witnessed them all her life. Her birth in 83 BC, though not a date carved into the records of Rome's most illustrious, would prove to be a quiet harbinger of change. For in the years that followed, the political landscape of the Republic would fracture, and in the very heart of that fracture, Fulvia would take her first steps toward shaping her destiny. The story of her early life is one marked by loss, yet also by the cultivation of a sharp mind. Her mother had died when she was young, and she had been raised by her father and the servants who scurried about the villa, whispering of family politics, of alliances that came and went as quickly as a summer rain. But even in her youth, Fulvia had learned to listen more carefully than most, to absorb the nuances of power, and to understand the delicate threads that held Rome together. By the time she was 16, Fulvia's beauty had become undeniable. Yet it was not this feature that made her stand out among the great families of Rome. Rather, it was her intellect and her family's connections that positioned her for a future beyond the typical confines of marriage. Her first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, a man who would become one of the most infamous politicians of his time. Clodius, populist with no shortage of charisma, had captured the attention of Rome with his daring and often reckless moves against the traditional ruling elite. He was a man who understood how to manipulate the masses, how to turn the plebeians into an unstoppable force, and how to undermine the aristocracy's hold over the city. Fulvia's marriage to Clodius was not one built on romantic love, but rather on a shared vision for the future. Both of them understood the significance of the other's position. He was a populist with radical ideas, and she was a member of one of Rome's old families, holding power in the Senate's ancient traditions. Together, they represented the union of the old Rome and the rising new order, an alliance that threatened to overturn the traditional political structure. In those early years, Fulvia found herself thrust into the political turmoil of the city. Clodius's radical ideas resonated deeply with the plebeians, and Fulvia, with her sharp wit, quickly became an essential part of his political maneuverings. She understood the value of symbolism in Roman politics, how one's public image could make or break a career. As Clodius made his mark on the streets of Rome, Fulvia helped shape his political rhetoric, aiding in the crafting of speeches and public appearances that spoke to the hearts of the Roman people. But their alliance would be short-lived. In 52 BC, Clodius met a violent end at the hands of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. It was a day that would forever change Fulvia's path, setting her on a course that would forever be linked with the great figures of Roman history. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, and the political landscape shifted once again. Clodius's supporters, known for their fiery passion, were left to avenge their leader's murder, and Fulvia, a widow at a young age, found herself caught in the midst of a bloody struggle. The streets of Rome turned into battlegrounds, and Fulvia was no mere observer. As Clodius's widow, Fulvia assumed a role she had never expected. The loss of her husband, who had been both a lover and a political ally, forced her to decide what kind of power she wished to wield. Would she step aside, as most women would, allowing her grief to define her? Or would she take up the mantle of political influence, using her family's name and her own ambition to carve out a new path? In the months following Clodius's death, Fulvia displayed a remarkable resilience. She refused to allow Clodius's enemies to destroy the legacy he had built. She rallied his supporters and used her influence to press for his ideas and cause. Even in her mourning, she was not content to retreat into obscurity. With Clodius's name still fresh in the minds of the people, Fulvia became a symbol of defiance against the traditional elite. It was during this period of political instability that Fulvia's path would cross with that of Mark Antony, a general and political figure who, like her, was in search of a new order in Rome. Their relationship would change the course of her life, but before they would become allies, Fulvia first had to navigate the treacherous waters of Rome's shifting allegiances. The Senate, still reeling from Clodius's death and the constant threat of violence in the streets, was deeply divided. The civil strife was in full swing, and in this climate of uncertainty, Fulvia began to make a name for herself, not only as a widow who had defied the odds, but also as a woman capable of wielding power in her own right. Her efforts to hold onto Clodius's influence had earned her the respect of many, but it was also creating enemies. With the rise of Julius Caesar's power and the ensuing conflict between him and the Senate, Fulvia found herself swept into a political storm that would forever alter her destiny. It was a time of great danger, but also of opportunity. As the Republic tore itself apart, Fulvia realized that in this chaos, there was a chance to change the narrative. No longer just a widow grieving her husband's loss, she would emerge as one of the most formidable women of Rome, a woman who would stop at nothing to secure her place in the annals of history. And so, with the winds of Rome shifting rapidly around her, Fulvia took her first steps toward becoming one of the most politically astute figures of her time. Little did she know that her path would soon cross with that of Mark Antony, a man whose own ambitions would come to mirror her own, and whose alliance would change not only the course of her life but the future of Rome itself. The death of Publius Clodius Pulcher was not just a personal loss for Fulvia. It was a political earthquake that rippled through the very heart of Rome. In the days that followed his murder, The city seemed to crack open, spilling forth a tempest of violence and turmoil. The Senate, already divided and paralyzed by the growing influence of men like Julius Caesar, was now forced to reckon with the populist movement that Clodius had so fiercely championed. Rome had no time to mourn. There was too much at stake. Too many factions were eager to seize the power left in the wake of his death. But Fulvia was not one to retreat into the shadows, where many women in her position would have bowed to grief and stepped away from public life. Fulvia seized the opportunity with a fierce determination. She was not just a widow, she was a political force in her own right, and she would not allow her late husband's legacy to be forgotten or trampled by those who saw his death as an opportunity for gain. The streets of Rome were filled with the sounds of violence and rage, the rivalry between the populace, the faction of the people, to which Clodius had belonged, and the optimates, the aristocratic faction, was reaching a fever pitch. The Senate had long been dominated by the elite, but the populace, fueled by the power of the plebeians and the memory of Clodius's populist campaign, were determined to tip the scales in their favor. In this charged atmosphere, Fulvia made her move. She had learned early on that the game of Roman politics was played not only in the Senate and the forums but in the hearts and minds of the people. Clodius had been a master at stirring the plebeians to action, and Fulvia, now the widow of the fallen populist hero, knew that she too could rally them. She began speaking in public, delivering impassioned speeches that evoked her late husband's memory and called for the preservation of his ideals. But there was more to Fulvia's power than oratory. She understood the significance of alliances in Rome. The city was a web of relationships, familial, political, and military, and Fulvia knew how to navigate it. She reached out to the key figures of the populist movement, reminding them that the cause of the people could not be abandoned in Clodius's absence. She became a vocal advocate for the plebeian rights that Clodius had fought for, and in doing so, she began to position herself as the leader of his faction. Despite her prominence in the populist faction, Fulvia found herself in a delicate dance with some of Rome's most dangerous political figures. Julius Caesar, who had been rising steadily in power, had his own designs on Rome's future. Although Fulvia had little personal connection to Caesar, his political machinations were becoming inescapable. The war between Caesar and the Senate, which had been brewing for years, was finally reaching its breaking point, and Fulvia could no longer afford to remain neutral. Her connections with Caesar's allies, particularly the ever-ambitious Mark Antony, were growing stronger. Antony, a man with his own eye on power, was becoming a fixture in the populist movement, despite his deep ties to the military elite. Though much younger than Fulvia, Antony's strategic brilliance and his fierce loyalty to Caesar made him a valuable ally. Their alliance was not based on love or personal affection. It was built on mutual interest. Antony needed Fulvia's influence among the plebeians, and she needed his military connections and support in the Senate. The political landscape of Rome was shifting with every passing day. As Caesar's power grew, Fulvia realized that the future of Rome was no longer solely in the hands of the Senate. She understood that if she was to retain her influence, she would need to align herself with the new order. The question, however, was not whether she would ally herself with Caesar. It was which of Caesar's most trusted men she would choose as a partner. She had known Antony for some time, but now their relationship had moved beyond mere political necessity. In him, Fulvia saw a man who could help her secure not just her own future but that of her family. Yet, even as she made her move toward Antony, she was aware of the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. Antony, like most men in Roman politics, had his own ambitions, and Fulvia's increasing influence was a double-edged sword. She needed him, but she could never forget that, in the game of Roman power, even the most steadfast allies could quickly become enemies. Fulvia was not so naive as to believe her power was secure. Their first partnership was not one of passion but of necessity. Antony, who had been deeply involved in the affairs of Caesar's military campaigns, needed a woman like Fulvia, intelligent, politically savvy, and willing to engage with the masses. But Fulvia, despite the absence of romantic attachment, could see the potential in Antony. He was driven, brash, and eager to break free of the traditional structures of Roman leadership. His ambitions mirrored her own, and together, they formed an alliance that would change the course of their lives and the future of Rome. However, there was more to Fulvia's political machinations than simply supporting Antony's rise. She was not just a passive partner. She was a calculating force in her own right, and she understood that Rome was a city defined by betrayal, violence, and ambition. She knew that her power would be fleeting unless she positioned herself carefully within the shifting tides of Roman politics. The following months were marked by her involvement in the major political struggles of the time. She stood by Antony as he took on the task of consolidating power for Caesar's faction, especially during the political and military battles that followed Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. With the death of Caesar, Rome was plunged into a crisis of succession, and the vacuum left behind by his assassination opened the door for new alliances and rivalries. Fulvia's role during this time was not simply that of a bystander. She was deeply involved in the political maneuvering surrounding Caesar's death, using her position and influence to bolster Antony's claim to power. Her support for Antony became instrumental as he struggled to hold the reins of power, even as rivals, most notably Octavian, Caesar's heir, sought to undermine him. As the tensions between Antony and Octavian escalated, Fulvia knew that the stakes had never been higher. With the future of Rome hanging in the balance, she continued to use every tool at her disposal: her political acumen, her family connections, and her ability to galvanize the plebeians. But in this game of power, she also realized that she was walking a dangerous line. She had to trust Antony, but she also had to be prepared to outmaneuver him if necessary. Despite all her efforts, however, the political winds of Rome were shifting once again, and Fulvia found herself at a crossroads. She could no longer depend on Antony alone to secure her future. In the next few years, she would have to make decisions that would redefine her place in Roman history and, ultimately, determine whether she would be remembered as a pawn in the hands of powerful men or as a queen who had carved out her own legacy. The decision to marry Mark Antony was not born of love, but of necessity. The flames of ambition burned brightly in both Fulvia and Antony, and their union was forged in the fires of Rome's political chaos. Fulvia had come to recognize the immense potential in Antony, a man whose strategic brilliance and military prowess were rivaled only by his unrelenting ambition. Antony was a man who had the strength to win battles and the cunning to maneuver through the shifting sands of Roman politics. For Fulvia, who had navigated Rome's treacherous political landscape since Clodius's death, Antony represented an invaluable ally, a powerful man who shared her goals and vision for Rome's future. When Antony arrived in Rome following Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, he was already a man on the edge of greatness. His loyalty to Caesar and his status as one of the most trusted generals of the late Republic had earned him respect among Caesar's supporters. But Rome was a city of ever-shifting allegiances, and Antony, despite his military success, knew that he needed more than just soldiers at his back. He needed the political leverage to solidify his position in the wake of Caesar's death. He needed someone like Fulvia. Fulvia, now a widow and a woman whose name was entwined with the populist cause, saw in Antony the potential for a powerful alliance. She was no stranger to the cutthroat nature of Roman politics, and she understood that the most successful leaders were those who knew how to consolidate power from every angle: military might, popular support, and strategic marriages. Her previous relationship with Clodius had taught her the importance of securing the loyalty of the plebeians. And now, in Antony, she saw a man who could help her achieve that in a new and more profound way. Their union was not one of passion, but of shared goals. Antony needed Fulvia's influence, particularly among the plebeians, who still revered her as the widow of Clodius. He also recognized her keen political mind and her ability to navigate the labyrinthine world of Roman politics. For Fulvia, the marriage was an opportunity to cement her position in the ever-changing political landscape of Rome. Antony was a man of action, but he was often impulsive and reckless. Fulvia, on the other hand, had learned to be patient, calculating, and shrewd in the pursuit of power. Together, they made a formidable team. Their marriage also represented the growing tensions between the political factions in Rome. On one side was the Senate, dominated by the old aristocracy, who were still reeling from Caesar's murder and feared the rise of any man who could challenge their control. On the other side was the faction loyal to Caesar, which now included Antony, along with the young Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Rome was a powder keg, and the marriage between Fulvia and Antony was, in many ways, a symbolic act of defiance against the Senate and its traditional order. Yet, even as their alliance grew stronger, Fulvia found herself increasingly caught in the web of Antony's own ambitions. Antony, despite his political acumen, was a man driven by passion. He had been Caesar's right-hand man, and his loyalty to the fallen dictator was unshakable. But loyalty to Caesar, in the world of Roman politics, came with its own set of risks. Fulvia knew that Antony's deep emotional ties to Caesar, particularly in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, could either make or break him. As Antony became embroiled in the power struggle between Caesar's loyalists and the Senate, Fulvia found herself increasingly involved in the political strategy that would shape the future of Rome. The two of them were not simply husband and wife, they were partners in a shared vision for Rome's future. Antony would lead the military campaigns, while Fulvia would work behind the scenes to secure Antony's position and influence in the Senate. It was during this time that Fulvia's political savvy became crucial. Rome was in the midst of a power vacuum, with no clear leader after Caesar's death. Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, was in Rome, and he was quickly making moves to solidify his own claim to power. Though young and inexperienced, Octavian was no fool. He had inherited Caesar's political genius and was rapidly gaining supporters among the people and the Senate. Antony, in contrast, was still viewed by many as a soldier rather than a statesman, and his position in Rome was precarious. Fulvia knew that if Antony was to succeed, he would need the support of the people. She began to work tirelessly to secure their loyalty, using her connections with the plebeians and her reputation as the widow of Clodius. She spoke at public gatherings, rallying the masses to Antony's cause, reminding them of the populist ideals that Caesar had espoused and that Antony now represented. In doing so, she solidified her own standing as a key player in Rome's political arena. But it was not only the plebeians who needed to be kept in line. The Senate, still reeling from the loss of Caesar, was filled with men who viewed Antony as a threat to their authority. Fulvia, aware of the fragile nature of their alliance, worked tirelessly to maintain diplomatic relations with key senators, using her charm and political acumen to smooth over tensions and ensure Antony's survival in the Senate. As the political situation in Rome grew more volatile, Fulvia's role became increasingly important. She was no longer just the wife of a prominent general. She was a political strategist in her own right, a woman who understood the intricate balance of power in Rome. Her influence over Antony was significant, and it was clear that she played a crucial role in his decision-making. Yet, even as their political partnership deepened, Fulvia was aware of the risks involved. Antony, despite his loyalty to her, was still a man driven by his own desires, and she knew that his ambitions could easily pull him away from her. The rise of Octavian, who was rapidly gaining power, loomed over their alliance. The relationship between Antony and Octavian was becoming increasingly strained, and Fulvia found herself caught in the middle of their rivalry. Octavian, though young, was cunning and ruthless, and he was not afraid to use his political acumen to weaken Antony's position. The political tug-of-war between Antony and Octavian would soon come to a head, and Fulvia, ever the strategist, began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It was clear that the power struggle between the two men would ultimately determine the fate of Rome, and Fulvia knew that the stakes could not be higher. She had been a player in Rome's political game for years, But now the game had escalated to its most dangerous level. The marriage between Antony and Fulvia, once a strategic alliance, had evolved into a partnership defined by mutual ambition, love, and, increasingly, betrayal. As the tension between Antony and Octavian reached its boiling point, Fulvia's role in the future of Rome became more critical than ever. She had been the architect of their early success. But now, with the Roman world on the brink of war, she would need to use all her skills to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics before it was too late. The death of Julius Caesar had left an indelible scar on Rome, and the city now stood on the precipice of chaos. His murder by the Senate, despite being hailed as an act of liberation by the aristocratic factions, had only further entrenched the deep political divide that already fractured the Republic. The people, loyal to Caesar and his vision, were unwilling to let his death go unpunished. The Senate, meanwhile, found itself unable to unite behind a single leader. It was into this vacuum that the Second Triumvirate was born, an alliance forged from necessity, ambition, and, in Fulvia's case, a cold determination to secure power. In 43 BC, Antony, alongside Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, a political and military coalition with one singular purpose: to avenge Caesar's assassination and restore order to Rome. But unlike the First Triumvirate, this new coalition was not an alliance of friendship and mutual respect. It was a marriage of convenience, and the figures at the head of it were no strangers to ambition, manipulation, and betrayal. Fulvia's involvement in the triumvirate was not merely as a passive observer. She was a key player in the strategic planning that would lead to its formation. Her ties to Antony, which had already proved valuable, now became more significant than ever. She understood the stakes. With Caesar dead and the Senate fractured, the future of Rome lay in the hands of those who could control both the legions and the people. She had already helped Antony secure his position among the plebeians. But now, with the triumvirate taking shape, she knew she needed to expand her influence beyond the streets and into the battlefield. Antony, once a fierce ally to Caesar, now stood alongside Octavian, the young heir of Caesar's legacy, and Lepidus, who brought the support of his legions to the coalition. The formation of the triumvirate marked the beginning of a violent and unstable period for Rome, as the triumvirs sought to eliminate their political enemies and consolidate their power. For Fulvia, the chaos of the Republic offered an opportunity to exert even more influence behind the scenes. While the political landscape was being reshaped in Rome, Antony was busy preparing for war. The triumvirs' first order of business was to eliminate the forces loyal to the assassins of Caesar, led by Brutus and Cassius, who had fled to the east. But the struggle for control of Rome was not limited to the east. In the west, there was another battle brewing, a struggle for control over the very heart of the Republic itself. It was during this period of turmoil that the Perusine War would break out, a conflict that would cement Fulvia's reputation as a woman who would not shy away from using force to secure her position. The Perusine War, fought in 41 BC, was not merely a battle between soldiers. It was a political struggle that would test the alliances of the triumvirs and reveal just how far Fulvia was willing to go to protect Antony's power and, by extension, her own. Antony, after securing victories in the east, had to turn his attention to Rome, where tensions were rising between his faction and the forces loyal to Octavian. Octavian, despite his youth and inexperience, was rapidly consolidating power in Rome, and the time had come for him to confront his former allies. Fulvia, already wary of Octavian's ambitions, knew that the alliance between Antony and Octavian was fragile at best. She understood the growing rivalry between the two men and feared that Antony's position was vulnerable. The time for inaction was over. She would have to act decisively to defend her family's legacy. Fulvia, who had already proven herself as a politically astute figure, took matters into her own hands when tensions with Octavian came to a head. She personally led an army to the city of Perugia, determined to defend her position and strike at the heart of Octavian's influence. The situation was dire. Octavian had already begun to gain the loyalty of key military commanders in Rome, and Fulvia knew that she had no choice but to confront him head-on. The Perusine War was a bloody and brutal conflict, one in which Fulvia's leadership would be tested to its limits. She took charge of the besieged city, holding strong against Octavian's forces for months. Her defiance in the face of overwhelming odds would not go unnoticed. In those early days, as the siege wore on, Fulvia worked tirelessly to maintain the morale of her soldiers. She made sure they were well supplied, keeping the siege going long enough to send a message to Octavian that she would not back down without a fight. However, despite her resilience and military tenacity, Fulvia was forced to face the reality that her resources were running out. Her troops were beginning to feel the strain of the prolonged siege, and food was in short supply. Antony, distracted by his campaigns in the east, was unable to provide the reinforcements she desperately needed. Fulvia's hopes of securing victory began to fade as Octavian's forces tightened their grip. But it was not just the military aspect of the war that would determine the outcome. It was the political dynamics that were shifting behind the scenes. Octavian, ever the shrewd tactician, knew that he could not simply crush Fulvia's forces through force alone. He needed to break her resolve, and so he began to make diplomatic overtures, attempting to exploit the cracks that were beginning to show in the triumvirate. The war ended with a peace agreement brokered by Antony himself, who had been pressured by both sides to intervene. The city of Perugia fell to Octavian's forces, and Fulvia, despite her resolute defense, was forced to surrender. The aftermath of the war was a bitter one, though Fulvia's military leadership had been impressive. The loss at Perugia marked the beginning of her unraveling as a political force in Rome. Her relationship with Antony, once strong and mutually beneficial, began to show signs of strain. Antony's allegiance to her seemed less certain with each passing day. He had been forced to make concessions to Octavian, and the demands of his military campaigns in the east were taking a toll on his connection to Rome. Fulvia, knowing that her power was slipping, began to realize the precarious nature of her position. The events surrounding the Perusine War had shown her that, even with her influence over the plebeians and her political acumen, her survival in the ever-shifting world of Roman politics would depend not only on Antony's loyalty but on her ability to outmaneuver Octavian. As the dust settled after the war, Fulvia found herself increasingly isolated. Antony had distanced himself from her to ensure his survival, and Fulvia's fate hung in the balance. Despite her leadership in Perugia, the future of the triumvirate and the balance of power between the three men, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, had shifted irrevocably. The political tides were turning, and Fulvia could not help but sense that the end of the Republic and the rise of a new Roman Empire was drawing nearer. The fall of Perugia was a blow from which Fulvia would never fully recover. It was not just the defeat in battle that left its mark on her. It was the sense of betrayal that lingered long after the dust had settled. She had led her forces against Octavian's armies with unwavering determination. But in the end, the walls of the city crumbled, not because of the might of Octavian's legions, but because of her growing isolation. Her husband, Mark Antony, had failed to provide the support she had expected. He had, for all his promises, been distracted by the allure of the East, by the seduction of Cleopatra, and by his own ambitions. When the news of Perugia's fall reached Antony, he was forced to act. But his intervention, though necessary to prevent total disaster, was calculated, driven by pragmatism rather than loyalty. He brokered a peace agreement with Octavian, and Fulvia, broken yet proud, was left to face the consequences. She had not been defeated by Octavian's soldiers alone. She had been undone by the political dynamics within her own alliance. As she returned to Rome, her heart heavy with the weight of failure, Fulvia knew that her relationship with Antony had been irreparably changed. The man she had fought so hard for, her partner in ambition, had made it clear where his loyalties now lay. Antony had promised to return to her side, but that promise had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. His attention had already shifted to Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, who had begun to weave a web of influence over him that Fulvia could never compete with. The betrayal was not just personal, it was political. The consequences of Antony's actions were beginning to unravel the very fabric of their alliance. The tensions between Octavian and Antony, which had been building ever since Caesar's assassination, were now reaching a fever pitch. The triumvirate, once a powerful coalition, was slowly falling apart. And at the center of this fracture was Fulvia, the woman who had stood by Antony's side, only to find herself discarded when the political winds shifted. But Fulvia was not a woman to retreat into the shadows of obscurity. Despite the personal wounds, she understood that the game of politics was never about love, it was about power, and she would do everything in her power to regain her standing. In the aftermath of her defeat, Fulvia began to rebuild, carefully navigating the political landscape of Rome, and watching the unraveling of the triumvirate with keen interest. She knew that Octavian, despite his youth, was the rising force in Rome. She had once stood against him, but now, with Antony's gaze fixed on Cleopatra and the East, Fulvia knew that she would need to outmaneuver Octavian if she hoped to reclaim her place in the city's power structure. In the months following the end of the Prowess War, Fulvia's marriage to Antony began to crumble. Much as the Republic had, the distance between them grew, both physically and emotionally. Antony, entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt, had begun to distance himself from Rome and from Fulvia. His betrayal, though political in nature, cut deep into Fulvia's heart. Yet, it was not just the emotional wounds that she had to contend with, it was the political ramifications. As Antony's ties to Cleopatra solidified, Fulvia found herself facing a new, more insidious form of betrayal: neglect. The political power she had fought so fiercely for now seemed out of her reach. It was clear to Fulvia that her marriage to Antony was coming to an end, but she could not simply accept defeat. Her resolve, which had held strong in the face of her enemies and the losses she had endured, was now being tested in a new way. She was no longer the wife of a rising star in Rome. She was a political widow, left to chart her own course in a city that had no room for those who fell from favor. Fulvia's divorce from Antony was not a matter of love. It was a strategic decision, born from the understanding that she could no longer rely on her husband for power. Antony had made his choices, and Fulvia knew that she would have to make hers. She began to look for new alliances, new opportunities to regain her political footing. But these were perilous times. Octavian's star was rising, and the divide between him and Antony was becoming a chasm that could not be crossed. The political tide in Rome was shifting, and Fulvia, once a powerful force in her own right, now found herself in the uncomfortable position of being a woman out of time. As she moved through the streets of Rome, now a woman scorned by her marriage and excluded from the powerful triumvirate, Fulvia began to realize something important. Her legacy was not tied to Antony or the triumvirate. It was tied to her own resilience. She had fought for power when it seemed impossible, had commanded armies when few would have dared, and had held her ground in the face of immense political pressure. Her efforts had been monumental, but Rome was a city that cared little for women who dared to wield power. She had always known that the path she walked was dangerous, but as the years passed, it became clear that, for all her sacrifices, Fulvia's role in Rome's history would be overshadowed by the men around her. Yet, despite her personal defeats, Fulvia's story was not one of total failure. In her final years, she began to reflect on the role she had played in shaping Rome's turbulent history. It was clear that, despite the betrayals, despite the personal losses, she had been an influential force in the Republic's final years. Her marriage to Antony, her leadership in the Prowess War, and her unyielding pursuit of political power had left a lasting imprint on Rome. But as she grew older and her political influence waned, she realized that she had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game played by men who, in the end, had no room for her. Fulvia's death in 40 BC marked the end of an era. She had lived and died in the shadow of the men she had loved and fought for. Yet, her contributions to the last days of the Roman Republic were undeniable. Even as her name faded into the annals of history, it remained clear that Fulvia had been a woman who defied the expectations of her time, a woman who fought not just for her place in the world, but for the future of Rome itself. Fulvia's world had fractured. In the span of a few short years, she had gone from a woman who commanded armies and shaped the course of Roman politics to a political widow, a woman who had fought so fiercely for power only to find herself cast aside by the very man she had helped elevate. The collapse of her marriage to Mark Antony was not a simple personal failure. It was a profound political shift, one that sent ripples through the power structures of Rome. The moment she realized their marriage was over, Fulvia understood that the very nature of the Roman world had shifted beneath her feet. Her separation from Antony came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as an erosion of their shared vision. Antony, distracted by Cleopatra's allure, had begun to make political moves that left Fulvia isolated. Their once shared ambition for power was now divided, and Antony's betrayal, though subtle in its execution, was no less devastating. His commitments to Cleopatra, and by extension to Egypt, left Fulvia standing alone in a Rome that no longer had a place for her. But Fulvia had never been one to retreat without a fight. Even as she felt the weight of betrayal, she could not afford to wallow in grief. The game of power was far too dangerous, far too precarious for someone like her to allow emotions to rule her actions. Fulvia knew that Rome was no longer a place where women could gain power through direct influence or force of will alone. Women like her, who sought to play in the political arena, needed to outthink and outmaneuver their rivals, not just rely on the strengths they had wielded in the past. Her divorce from Antony marked the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of another. The political fallout from this split was severe. Once seen as a key figure in the triumvirate, Fulvia's power and influence quickly began to diminish. The young Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, had been rising in the ranks ever since the death of Julius Caesar. And now that Antony was moving further east, Fulvia realized that Octavian, despite his youth, represented the future of Rome. His manipulations of public sentiment were brilliant, and his political genius could not be ignored. But the bitterness of her separation from Antony ran deep. The very thought of Octavian's rise irked Fulvia. She had fought so hard for her place in Roman politics, and now it seemed as if the balance of power had shifted beyond her reach. Still, Fulvia was not one to accept the inevitable. Her heart, though scarred by the rejection of the man she had loved, was still burning with ambition. She understood that alliances were the currency of Roman politics, and her next move would be critical in deciding her fate. Even as her influence waned, Fulvia sought to regain her standing. She began to look for new allies, new opportunities to reassert herself. Her first target was Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, who was in Rome at the time. She used every tool at her disposal: her intellect, her political savvy, and her ability to manipulate the plebeian masses to bring Lucius onto her side. Together, they worked to challenge Octavian's growing control over Rome. But Lucius, though an ally, was no Mark Antony. The political situation in Rome was changing too rapidly, and Fulvia knew that her time was running out. She also understood the importance of preserving her family's legacy. Her position as a widow, once a symbol of power, had now become a mark of vulnerability. The plebeians who had once rallied to her side, drawn by the memory of her late husband's populist cause, were no longer as steadfast. Fulvia's challenge was not only to restore her political influence, but also to remind the people of her importance. In Rome, where power was often derived from the approval of the masses, she had to regain their loyalty. But the political tides were shifting in ways Fulvia had not anticipated. Octavian's control over the military and the Senate continued to strengthen, and the rivalry between him and Antony became more pronounced. Despite her attempts to rally support through alliances and appeals to the plebeian class, Fulvia could not ignore the fact that she was fighting a losing battle. Antony, ensnared by Cleopatra's charm and political ambitions, was no longer the man she had once worked with. The seeds of the eventual civil war were being sown, and Fulvia, now divorced from Antony, found herself caught in the midst of it all. In the years following her divorce, Fulvia's life became a study in powerlessness, while Antony, in Egypt, grew closer to Cleopatra and consolidated his control in the East. Fulvia found herself struggling to navigate the complex and increasingly hostile political environment in Rome. Her final efforts to regain power were focused on the shift in the triumvirate's internal dynamics. As the rivalry between Antony and Octavian came to a head, it became increasingly clear that Octavian was gaining the upper hand in Rome. He had consolidated his power base, gaining the support of key military figures and, more importantly, the loyalty of the Senate. Antony, distracted by his distant alliance with Cleopatra and the Eastern territories, had neither the time nor the inclination to manage the political intricacies of Rome. Fulvia, once his trusted advisor, now found herself isolated. The bond they had shared, once so vital to both of their careers, was fraying beyond repair. Though Antony remained nominally in alliance with Octavian, their relationship had deteriorated to the point of open hostility. Fulvia, ever astute, knew that her time in Rome was coming to an end. She began to retreat from the political scene, no longer able to maneuver as effectively as she had once done. The future of Rome was no longer in the hands of men like her or Antony, who had been products of the Republic's old order. The rise of Octavian was inevitable, and he would soon transform into Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. As the political battles continued to rage, Fulvia's personal life became a source of increasing disappointment. Her efforts to regain Antony's affections and her political aspirations had faltered. She had been a woman who once stood alongside the most powerful men in Rome. But now, she was a forgotten figure in the eyes of the Senate and the people. She had been the architect of her own fate. But now, the tide had shifted. Fulvia, the fiery and ambitious woman who had once taken up arms in defense of her cause, was forced to watch as Rome moved further away from the republic she had once fought for. Fulvia's final days were marked by a mixture of sorrow and defiance. Though she had been separated from Antony, she was still a woman of immense intelligence and political insight. In her later years, she began to reflect on her life, her victories, and her failures. What had once seemed like a grand destiny, a future in which she could shape the Roman world, had unraveled into a tale of political isolation and betrayal. Her relationship with Antony, once so full of promise, had ended in distance and neglect. Yet, Fulvia was no stranger to adversity. Even in her final moments, she remained a figure who had fought relentlessly for power, who had outwitted rivals and rallied the people to her cause. Her story was not one of failure but of ambition, the kind of ambition that defined the final years of the Roman Republic. Fulvia's death in 40 BC was a quiet one, far from the grandeur that her life had once promised. But even as she faded from the political scene, her impact on the Republic lingered. She had been a woman who carved out a place for herself in a world dominated by men, a woman whose ambition and drive had once seemed to promise greatness, but who ultimately fell victim to the very political forces she had once controlled. In the annals of Roman history, Fulvia's name is often forgotten, overshadowed by the triumphs of men like Octavian and Antony. But for those who truly understand the political dynamics of the late Republic, her legacy is undeniable. She was a woman who lived and died by her ambition, and though the world she fought to shape ultimately passed her by, she remains a symbol of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Fulvia's death in 40 BC was a quiet one, an end that seemed far too modest for a woman who had once stood at the epicenter of the Republic's most turbulent and transformative years. There were no grand funerals or monuments in her honor, no statues to immortalize the woman who had once commanded armies and masterminded political strategies. Instead, Fulvia's passing was almost an afterthought, a footnote in the grand historical narrative of Rome. Yet, beneath the surface of her demise, there was a legacy that could not be entirely erased. She had fought for power, love, and a place in history, and though her efforts were not rewarded with eternal glory, they had not been in vain. As her health failed her, Fulvia spent her final days in contemplation. The memories of her life, of her political battles, of her marriage to Clodius and Antony, and of her struggles in the wake of their betrayal, weighed heavily on her heart. In her isolation, she must have thought back on the high points of her life, the moments when she had held the fate of Rome in her hands, when she had been a woman who could bend the political landscape to her will. And yet, as the years passed, she had come to realize that Rome was never meant to accommodate someone like her. Her ambitions had once been boundless, and in her mind, there was a certain beauty in the idea of a republic that was shaped by a woman's hand. Rome had always been a city of grand ambition, of men like Caesar, Antony, and Octavian, who sought to rewrite the rules of power. Yet, Fulvia's dreams of wielding that power, of carving out her own place in history, had been dashed by the very forces that had made her rise possible. Men who used her for their own gain, then discarded her when they no longer had need of her. Her final days were spent with her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the nature of power and its transience. In a world dominated by the military and political prowess of men, Fulvia had defied expectations. She had been a woman who led armies, who spoke in the Senate, who shaped political movements, but in the end, the politics of her time, ever-changing and brutal, had left her behind, while the world around her had already moved on. Fulvia's death was not entirely forgotten. In the years that followed, her name would fade into obscurity, overshadowed by the monumental rise of Augustus, once Octavian, the man who would go on to transform Rome from a republic into an empire. His reign would mark the beginning of an era that fulfilled the dreams of many Roman leaders. But those dreams came at a cost, the fall of the very ideals of the republic that Fulvia had fought for. However, in the hearts of a few who remembered the tumultuous years of the late republic, Fulvia's legacy lingered. She had been an agent of change in a time of immense political upheaval. She had been one of the few women who dared to enter the political arena on her own terms. For those who understood the depths of her ambition and the political acumen she wielded, Fulvia represented something more than a tragic footnote. She was a symbol of what could have been, a reminder of the untapped potential of women in Rome's political sphere. In the annals of Roman history, Fulvia was often remembered only as the wife of Antony, or as a brief player in the wars of succession that followed Caesar's death. But those who sought to understand the complexities of the late republic would see her for what she truly was, a woman of immense strength, intellect, and ambition who played a pivotal role in a revolution that would forever alter the Roman world. As Fulvia's death marked the end of her personal journey, it also symbolized the passing of the era in which she had lived. The fall of the Republic, with its ideals of senatorial rule and political checks and balances, gave way to the empire. Octavian's transformation into Augustus heralded the beginning of an imperial age that would last for centuries. And the power struggles that Fulvia had so bravely navigated faded into the backdrop of imperial expansion. For Octavian, whose rise to power had been marked by manipulations, alliances, and betrayals, the Republic was a thing of the past. His victory over Antony at Actium in 31 BC had sealed the fate of the Republic. And as the first emperor of Rome, he presided over a new era where the Senate held little real power. The civil wars that had torn Rome apart were now over, but at a cost. The very ideals that men like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had fought for in the early days of the Republic were extinguished. In their place, the imperial system took root, ushering in an age of consolidation and control, and Fulvia's dream of a republic defined by a broader power structure, one in which women might have a role, vanished into the dust of history. Fulvia's life was, in many ways, paradox, a woman who defied every expectation and rose to power in the heart of the Roman Republic. She was as much a symbol of possibility as she was of tragedy. Her ambition had been her greatest asset, but it also proved to be her undoing. While she had never attained the heights of power that she had dreamed of, her life represented a rebellion against the gendered limitations of her time. She fought, not just for her personal gain, but for a vision of Rome that allowed women to wield political influence. Yet, her inability to fully secure a place for herself within the new order of Rome was a harsh reminder that in Rome, power had always been firmly in the hands of men. Though Fulvia had tried to change that, she had ultimately been pushed aside by the very men who had once been her allies. In the final reckoning, she was no different from the many women of Rome who were written out of history, their names buried beneath the legacies of the men they had helped to shape. But even in her quiet death, Fulvia remained a symbol of the struggle for power in a changing world. Her life spoke to the untapped potential of women in Rome, a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who succeed, but by those who fight and fail. Her ambition, her courage, and her intelligence left an indelible mark on the story of Rome's transformation. Even if she did not live to see the empire that followed, her legacy, though obscured by the dominance of Augustus and the triumph of the imperial system, would live on in the hearts of those who understood the complexity of the late Republic. Fulvia was a woman who had been caught in the swirling tides of Rome's decline, but whose story would continue to inspire generations, long after the dust of Rome's grand transformation had settled. As Rome marched forward into its imperial age, the memory of Fulvia faded into the background, but the spirit of her ambition and defiance remained. The Republic may have fallen, and the empire may have risen, but the women who fought for power, for a voice, for a place in history like Fulvia would never be forgotten. They may not have won their battles, but they paved the way for future generations to continue the fight, ensuring that their stories would echo in the halls of power for centuries to come. And so, Fulvia's story, though incomplete, would live on as a testament to the power of a woman who dared to play the political game on her own terms, a woman who fought and failed, but whose ambition was never truly extinguished.